New York City, 1908. Stand at the Battery on a clear May morning and look north along Broadway. Among the accumulated stone and brick of lower Manhattan, one structure detaches itself from the skyline with an almost unseemly confidence. A slender tower rising 12 feet, its upper shaft clad in brick and terracotta, its crown a gilded wrought iron lantern catching the harbor light as if lit from within. On May 1, 1908, the dedication was covered by the New York Times, which called it a monument to American industrial genius. The description was accurate and insufficient. What stood at 149 Broadway was not merely an engineering achievement, but a declaration. Corporate identity pressed into steel and stone, funded by 10 million sewing machines sold into households across the world. It was the tallest habitable structure on Earth. In 1968, by deliberate choice, it also became the tallest building ever voluntarily demolished. Frederick Gilbert Bourne did not inherit his position. He constructed it the way a careful man constructs anything of lasting value. Methodically, with attention to materials, and with a clear understanding of what the finished object must communicate to those who see it. Born in Connecticut in 1851, Bourne entered the Singer Manufacturing Company as a young man of modest background and rose through its ranks across 3 decades with patient determination. He understood that corporations, like empires, reward those who learn their internal languages before attempting to speak their own. By 1889, he was the company's 5th president, and the title was not the end of his ambitions, but the platform from which he intended to launch them. What Bourne wanted was transformation. He sought passage from the category of successful businessman into something older, something American democracy officially denied yet culturally accommodated aristocracy. The evidence was visible in stone. In 1899, Bourne purchased Indian Neck Hall on Long Island, a Gilded Age estate of sweeping scale, its grounds descending toward the water like an English country house transplanted to Long Island Sound. Around the same period, he commissioned Dark Island Castle on the St. Lawrence River, a structure built in the manner of a Scottish baronial fortress, complete with turrets and a drawbridge. The architectural vocabulary of both properties was unmistakably European and unmistakably aristocratic. American commerce had made him wealthy. He intended it to make him noble. These acquisitions were not eccentricities. They were strategic. They illuminate the psychology that would eventually produce the Singer Tower. Bourne understood that identity is architectural. One builds what one wishes to become. Buildings communicate status across distances that words cannot bridge. A man may claim importance. A castle insists upon it. In a society without inherited titles, architecture performs the function that heraldry performs in older cultures. It marks. It announces. It endures. The commission for what would become the Singer Building emerged from this same conviction. Bourne's directive to architect Ernest Flagg, preserved in internal company memoranda, was specific in ambition, if not in technical detail. The building must express permanence and distinction. Not efficiency. Not economy. Not the rational provision of office space. Permanence and distinction. The two qualities aristocracy claims as its own, and that new wealth attempts to acquire through scale. Bourne did not want a functional headquarters. He wanted a monument, and he wanted it to be seen. Monuments are built to outlast their builders. They are statements addressed to the future, declarations that a dynasty, a corporation, An idea existed and mattered. Yet monuments are also expressions of a particular historical moment's vanity. And vanity ages more quickly than stone. What reads as magnificent aspiration in one era can read as overreach in another. Bourne assumed that permanence and distinction would remain stable values, that what impressed in 1908 would continue to impress in 1968. The 20th century dismantled that assumption with systematic efficiency. By the turn of the century, Bourne's personal fortune exceeded $5 million, a sum of genuine consequence before income tax and before inflation diluted the psychological weight of numbers. He was rich by any honest measure. Yet he understood that personal wealth and corporate monument were different instruments producing different effects. His estates were private statements. A tower at Broadway and Liberty Street would be public. It would be visible to arriving immigrants in the harbor, to competitors in neighboring buildings, to newspapers, and to the architectural press of the world. The tower was not a place for Bourne to live. It was a place for Bourne to be seen, and therefore a place for Singer to be seen. In 1908, before corporate identity had fully separated from the personality of its president, those two presences felt indistinguishable. Bourne stepped down from the presidency in 1905, 3 years before the tower's completion. The monument he commissioned was finished in his absence, inhabited by successors, and demolished 9 years after his death in 1919. The story of the Singer Tower is the story of ambition that outlived the intention that justified it. The monument remained standing long after the original desire that built it had dissolved. Ernest Flagg approached the commission already convinced that the skyscraper posed an aesthetic and civic problem. Paris-trained and a graduate of the École des Beaux Arts, he returned to America not only with ornamental vocabulary, but with convictions about what buildings owed to the streets they occupied. Those convictions shaped the Singer Tower from foundation to gilded crown and, in ways neither Flagg nor Bourne anticipated, contributed to its eventual obsolescence. Flagg argued that the skyscraper should be composed of 3 legible parts: a base, a shaft, and a crown, a tripartite grammar borrowed from the classical column and adapted to vertical modernity. The base would relate to the street, providing pedestrian scale and commercial vitality. The shaft would rise with restraint, occupying only a portion of the lot rather than consuming every rentable foot. The crown would resolve the building's upward thrust into a definitive architectural conclusion, rather than allowing it to stop abruptly where economics dictated. This was reform, not preference. Manhattan streets were already becoming canyons, dark, narrow corridors formed by sheer walls, rising lot line to lot line, blocking light and air. Flagg believed responsible ambition required restraint. The Singer shaft rose 12 feet, but occupied only about a quarter of its lot, leaving surrounding streets comparatively open to daylight. Ornament was not applied excess, but the logical completion of a formal argument. The façade was clad in brick and terracotta, articulated with pilasters and cornices, marking vertical rhythms disciplined by classical training. The gilded lantern crowned the structure, not as decoration, but as culmination. Every element spoke in the language of permanence. The building declared itself to the harbor, to the city, and to history. For a time, history agreed. The roofline of the lower building concluded in a mansard of green copper, a deliberate reference to the great French Second Empire buildings that Ernest Flagg had studied along the boulevards laid out by Georges, Hugues, Ni Haussmann, and on the streets surrounding the Palais Royal. Above the mansard, the tower shaft rose through its upper stories with increasing slenderness until it reached the lantern, a gilded, octagonal, wrought iron cupola derived from the domed pavilions of French Baroque architecture, and adapted so that its crown would remain legible from the harbor's distance. Flagg had not been Bourne's inevitable choice. He had been a deliberate one. Distinction in 1900 New York required an architect of established reputation. Someone who could promise that ambition would not slide into embarrassment. Paris, trained and associated with the prestige architecture of the American Renaissance, Flagg embodied that assurance. Their relationship reflected the characteristic Gilded Age arrangement between patron and architect. Money supplying ambition, training supplying form, and the completed building serving as the public expression of a private negotiation between what could be afforded and what must be displayed. Steel arrived at the site throughout 1906 and 1907, hauled from Bethlehem steel mills in Pennsylvania, transported by rail and barge to Manhattan, then lifted by crane in sections requiring specialized rigging and crews accustomed to heights that would have been considered industrial suicide a generation earlier. The annual reports of the Singer Manufacturing Company described expenditures in language crafted to communicate investment rather than cost. The distinction was financially accurate and strategically essential. Framed as capital expenditure, the tower became infrastructure. Framed as indulgence, it risked appearing as vanity. The company ensured it would be understood as the former. The structural system was steel cage construction. By 1907, the established technology for buildings of such height, vertical columns and horizontal beams, fabricated in shops and connected in the field by teams of ironworkers who labored without the safety equipment later generations would consider elementary, formed the building's skeleton. Around that skeleton rose the elaborate buiques, art skins of brickwork at the lower stories, terracotta ornament at every level. The mansard's copper framing accumulated piece by piece until the green roof emerged above the financial district skyline like an import from a Parisian arrondissement. The lantern crown required specialized ironworkers, skilled not in structural framing, but in ornamental metalwork. A craft abundant in the late 19th century and already approaching redundancy in the early 20th. What it physically meant to build the world's tallest building in 1908 cannot be fully reconstructed, but its outlines remain clear. Workdays extended from early morning until fading light, 6 days a week. Height introduced new conditions. Wind loads that affected both men and materials. Temperature differentials that altered the behavior of steel hundreds of feet above street level. And the psychological dimension of labor performed in open air at extraordinary elevation. Construction records refer to workers largely in aggregate terms, numbers rather than names. The documentary convention reveals its own limitation. The building's timeline and costs survive intact. The human texture of its making survives only in fragments. Terracotta ornament, manufactured to Flagg's specifications in New Jersey, and delivered in precisely dimensioned pieces, required skilled masons capable of translating drawings into sculpted surface. Each plaster capital, each cornice molding, each decorative panel drawn from the French Renaissance vocabulary demanded judgment as well as strength. This multiplication of skilled decisions, ornament requiring human evaluation rather than mechanical replication, made the building beautiful and made it expensive in ways a later century devoted to efficiency would struggle to justify. When the Singer Tower was completed and dedicated in May 1908, it held the world height record. It retained that distinction for exactly 18 months before being surpassed by the Metropolitan Life Tower on Madison Square. 18 months is a brief reign for the tallest building on Earth. The brevity foreshadowed the structure's entire history. Genuine achievement, genuine beauty, perpetually overtaken by the competitive logic it helped normalize. Every rivet driven into its steel frame also reinforced the principle that height invited challenge. Once competition becomes the dominant language of architecture, no argument is ever complete. There is only the next surpassing. The Singer Manufacturing Company sold more than sewing machines. It sold transformation. A woman seated at home, footworking a treadle, hands guiding cloth beneath a needle, participated in something modern and industrial, something linking her domestic interior to the largest commercial network yet assembled. By 1908, Singer operated on every inhabited continent, maintained factories in New Jersey and Scotland, employed sales agents across Russia, India, Brazil and China, and produced more than 2 million machines annually. The tower at 149 Broadway was not the beginning of that empire. It was its coronation. The sewing machine itself was not originally Singer's invention. Elias Howe patented the lock-stitch mechanism in 1846, and Isaac Merritt Singer refined it, litigated aggressively to defend it, and helped form the sewing machine combination, a patent pool that stabilized the industry while allowing Singer to extract licensing fees and reinvest in scale. What Singer truly pioneered was the installment payment plan. By selling machines on credit, $1 down, $1 a month, the company made industrial technology accessible to households unable to afford a lump sum purchase. The genius was financial and psychological as much as mechanical. Singer did not wait for customers to seek its product. Agents went door to door, demonstrated machines in kitchens, and departed only after leaving the machine itself behind, already threaded, already part of the room. This intimacy with the domestic sphere created an empire that resembled infrastructure more than commerce. Networks of agents, repair technicians, supply depots, and showrooms penetrated markets where few American firms maintained a permanent presence. In Russia alone, Singer operated thousands of outlets and employed tens of thousands of agents. In Japan, Egypt, and Argentina, the treadle machine arrived as both labor-saving device and ambassador of American industrial culture. The product's association with femininity did not diminish its reach, it expanded it. Singer entered societies not with soldiers or extractive machinery, but with thread and needle. The imperial logic of the company was subtle, embedded in kitchens and workshops rather than barracks and mines. The irony at the center of the Singer Tower was structural. The machine that financed it was associated with women's labor, with domestic interiors and repetitive handwork. The tower it funded was emphatically public, vertical, competitive, visible for miles. Women working treadles in New Jersey tenements, Russian villages, and Indian workshops were, in the most literal financial sense, underwriting the gilded lantern that crowned a skyscraper they would never enter. Singer's annual reports listed production figures with the pride of a general counting troops. 2 million machines in 1905, climbing year after year. Each machine represented more than a sale. It created a recurring relationship, a need for replacement parts, for oil, for bobbins and thread, for Singer's own branded accessories. The domestic sphere was structured to generate the monumental. The needle funded the tower. Ernest Flagg understood this, at least in aesthetic terms. His building was not conceived as a factory or a utilitarian container for office workers. It was a classical argument about what commercial power should resemble when it aspired to permanence. The three-part composition he developed, a broad base functioning as a commercial podium, a slender central shaft rising with aristocratic restraint, and a crowned terminus declaring itself against the sky, translated corporate character into architectural language. Singer was not merely large. It was refined, global, technically sophisticated. The building would not simply be tall, it would be articulate. The gilded wrought, iron lantern at its apex, illuminated at night by the newest electric technology available, transformed ambition into declaration. Visible from Brooklyn Harbor on a clear morning, catching the light before the streets below had warmed, it announced presence and permanence. Ships carrying Singer machines passed beneath a crown financed by the very machines in their holds. The contest for the Manhattan skyline began not with engineering but with envy, when the New York Tribune building rose to 260 feet in 1875. It exceeded any commercial height the city had previously permitted. The press treated its elevation not simply as technical progress, but as social assertion. Journalism, or at least the enterprise behind it, had earned vertical expression. When the Manhattan Life Insurance Building surpassed it in 1894 at 348 feet, admiration shifted into competition. The skyscraper had become an instrument of corporate identity, a way to render ambition visible to everyone who looked upward, which in lower Manhattan meant nearly everyone. Flagg regarded this competition with unease. In his 1908 essay, published in the Architectural Record, he argued that the unchecked skyscraper, one occupying its entire lot and rising as high as the market permitted, constituted a civic failure. Such buildings created canyon streets, blocked light, deprived neighboring structures of air, and transformed sidewalks into corridors of perpetual shadow. His solution was the slender tower. Restrict the footprint. Allow the tower to rise freely above a substantial base, and crown it with a terminus that contributed visual intelligence, rather than mere accumulation to the skyline. The Singer Tower embodied that argument. Its shaft occupied roughly 1/4 of its site, rising from a 10-story base that filled the lot before narrowing into a 61-12-foot ascent. By the standards of the era, this was radical restraint. Many contemporaries remained unconvinced. Daniel Burnham, whose Flatiron building had demonstrated the prevailing logic of maximum lot occupation, viewed Flagg's position as aesthetic preference elevated into theory. Cass Gilbert, designing the Woolworth building, pursued permanence through scale and practicality, floor after rentable floor, without the costly luxury of empty air. The marketplace sided with Burnham and Gilbert. Slender towers were beautiful, but in a real estate economy they were inefficient. Floors unbuilt meant rents uncollected. The height competition between 1900 and 1910 was therefore financial rivalry in architectural disguise. The Metropolitan Life Tower surpassed Singer's record in 1909, rising above 700 feet and holding the world record until the Woolworth Building displaced it in 1913. Each new milestone was announced as civic triumph, proof of American industrial supremacy. While the underlying motivation remained straightforward, more height meant more rentable area and greater prestige. The architectural press tracked the contest with the attentiveness of sports reporting. Readers understood each new record as an argument about which corporation most fully embodied the city's self-image. Singer held the title for 18 months. The Metropolitan Life Tower's completion was not merely technical succession, but cultural displacement. Singer's slender shaft and gilded lantern were undeniably beautiful. They were also costly and comparatively inefficient, and efficiency increasingly defined what New York rewarded. The new century did not reject beauty, it regarded it with indifference. Critics of canyon streets did not prevail, they were ignored. The skyline continued to accumulate bulk and height, according to the arithmetic of the ledger. The Singer Tower stood among newer giants, like a meticulously dressed participant in a competition judged solely en masse. Flagg's principles were largely correct. They simply did not alter the incentives governing development. After the height race moved north, and the tower became merely tall rather than tallest, what remained was the building itself, its ornament, its crown, its presence in the lower Manhattan streetscape. It persisted as evidence that an argument had once existed about what skyscrapers were meant to say. The argument was lost. The building endured. Entering the Singer Tower in 1908 revealed immediately that it was not designed solely for use. It was designed for experience. Flagg and his clients at the Singer Manufacturing Company calibrated the interior with jeweler's precision. The lobby was finished in veined marble, polished and luminous. Its ceiling rose nearly 30 feet, a dimension without strict functional necessity. Elevators did not require such height to move passengers efficiently. The volume existed to slow visitors, to draw their gaze upward, to produce the involuntary tilt of the head associated with awe before composure intervened. The lobby performed a psychological operation. Contemporary accounts indicate that it succeeded. The elevator cages were supplied by the Otis Elevator Company, by then the definitive provider of vertical transport for New York's ambitions. In the Singer Tower, they were not merely functional mechanisms, but ornamental ironwork. The decorative vocabulary of the exterior reappeared at intimate scale within the enclosures that carried occupants upward. Floors sliding past as if the city itself were in motion. The ironwork inside the elevators was gilded in places, its panels detailed with motifs, echoing the building's French Renaissance vocabulary. To ride upward within the Singer Tower was to experience continuity. The building extended its argument about beauty and permanence into the mechanics of its own circulation. Nothing was merely structural. Every component also functioned as declaration. The upper floors housed the executive and administrative offices of the Singer Manufacturing Company, and the firm used its address with deliberate precision. Long before the phrase, brand identity, entered common usage, Singer understood its power. Letters bearing 149 Broadway carried credibility embedded in geography. The address itself signaled stability. It announced that the sender operated from the tallest building in the world, crowned in gilded iron and visible from the harbor of the most commercially ambitious city on earth. In 1908, 149 Broadway meant something unmistakable. It meant height, ornament, harbor views, global reach. It meant a company whose machines occupied millions of homes. To receive correspondence from that address was to understand that Singer presented itself not simply as large, but as permanent. The address functioned as message. Near the summit of the tower, reached by elevator and a final stair, lay the observation gallery housed within the lantern itself. Admission was charged. The decision was practical and revealing. The building had been erected so that the city would look up at Singer. Yet Singer also offered the public the opportunity to look outward from Singer, and it attached a fee to the privilege. The gallery commanded a view uninterrupted by comparable height. Visitors standing within the lantern saw lower Manhattan stretched beneath them, the harbor unfolding outward, Brooklyn in the distance, the Hudson and East River converging, and on clear days the hills of New Jersey faint on the horizon. The vantage point allowed the city to be experienced from above, specifically from above as Singer. Frederick Gilbert Bourne signed the documents authorizing construction of the Singer Tower, and then, in 1905, 3 years before its completion, resigned from the presidency of the Singer Manufacturing Company. The timing reflected intention rather than coincidence. Bourne had spent 16 years transforming Singer into a global commercial empire. He stepped down at 53, having simultaneously constructed another monument, one that expressed a different understanding of success. Dark Island Castle rose from a small island in the St. Lawrence River near Alexandria Bay, where the tower was vertical, public, and designed for millions of eyes. The castle was horizontal, private, and designed for one household and its guests. The tower declared corporate supremacy. The castle declared personal withdrawal. Bourne had assembled the materials for that withdrawal throughout his tenure. Indian Neck Hall on Long Island, acquired in 1899, and Dark Island Castle, completed in the early 1900s. Together they formed an alternate biography. Ambition translated into American landed aristocracy rather than commerce. Bourne, the son of a New York merchant and educated without European aristocratic credentials, compensated through acquisition, estates, staff, and the visual language of English and Scottish nobility. The Singer Tower participated in this compensation. It functioned as justification, a monument capable of elevating wealth into achievement. Many fortunes of the Gilded Age could claim wealth. Few could claim the tallest building in the world. Once Bourne left Singer, however, the tower ceased to belong to him. It belonged to the corporation. His successor, James Bolton, occupied the executive office. The structure settled into institutional life as headquarters rather than testament. Corporate architecture follows institutional logic. It belongs to the organization, not the individual. Institutions do not preserve buildings for narrative reasons, they preserve them for utility. Bourne lived until 1919. He witnessed the Metropolitan Life Tower, and the Woolworth Building surpass the height he had commissioned. He observed Manhattan's commercial center migrate northward away from Lower Broadway. He died at 67 in Dark Island Castle, the private monument he preferred. His obituaries referenced Singer and mentioned the tower. Yet they could not anticipate that the building would stand 49 years beyond his death and eventually be remembered more vividly for its demolition than for its operation. The separation between patron and monument is a recurring architectural pattern. born imagined legacy, and departed before inhabiting its consequences. The tower became corporate asset, streetscape feature, and eventually a real estate problem addressed through financial calculation. The private castle endures. The public monument vanished. Scale did not guarantee permanence. In the years following completion, the city discovered something unexpected about the gilded lantern crown. Its greatest impact came after dark. By day, the slender shaft rose with composure above lower Broadway, ornament catching afternoon light. By night, illumination transformed it. Electric light in 1908 still carried the aura of novelty. When the lantern crown was lit, gilded iron reflecting electric glow, it appeared to hover above the darkened shaft like a detached constellation. Photographers returned repeatedly to capture it. Postcards proliferated. The illuminated crown became an image the city desired to possess and reproduce. Electrical current was supplied by Consolidated Edison, whose contracts and voltage specifications survive as prosaic records. Load calculations and maintenance schedules attached to an object of public fascination. Facilities managers documented illumination times, replacement intervals, and the upkeep of fixtures within the crown. What appeared magical in photographs existed operationally as a system of components, invoices, and routine service. The gap between architectural experience and operational reality is universal, yet, in the Singer Tower, it felt especially stark. The lantern that stirred imagination also appeared on maintenance checklists. Photographers, working in an era when architectural photography was defining its own methods, found in the tower a demanding subject. Street-level views exaggerated verticality, foreshortening distorted proportion. Capturing both base and crown within a single frame required technical innovation. The Singer Tower became not only a landmark, but a proving ground for the visual language used to represent height itself. Its slender profile was easier to resolve than the broader Buick's arts towers of its era. Because the shaft was so narrow, photographers could frame the entire composition, base, shaft, and crown within a tighter visual field. From rooftops across Broadway or elevated vantage points in neighboring buildings, the Singer Tower rewarded the effort. It offered an image that felt complete, something many bulkier contemporaries could not provide. The photographs endured. They circulated as postcards, as press illustrations, and as formal architectural documentation preserved in archives long after the structure itself disappeared. The nocturnal image became the defining one. In a photograph from around 1910, the gilded crown glows against an overexposed gray sky, the tower's shaft dissolving into darkness below. That single image compresses everything the Singer Tower represented to the culture that created it. It is a portrait of power and beauty at once, commercial ambition refined into ornament. It captures a city convinced it was constructing permanence, even as it unknowingly laid the groundwork for obsolescence. The electric light that made the crown radiant also heralded technological change that would soon render the building outdated. Advances in electrical systems, elevators, and structural engineering steadily left the Singer Tower behind. At night, the illuminated crown functioned as advertising in its purest form. Not a sign with words, but a persistent visual identity repeated until it fused with the company itself. In 1912, to think of Singer Manufacturing was to think of the tower. To think of the tower was to imagine the crown burning above the harbor. This was the ambition of every Gilded Age corporate commission: to transform architecture into memory, into brand, into an image inseparable from identity. Singer achieved it. The tower was Singer. The crown was the tower. The photographs survive. The crown does not. When demolition crews dismantled it in 1968, it was taken apart like any obsolete industrial apparatus. The fragments were dispersed, or discarded without ceremony. What remains is the image, the gilded lights suspended above a darkened city, commerce constructing and commerce erasing. Singer manufacturing did not collapse in the 1920s. It remained profitable, its machines present in households across continents. Its brand so widespread it became almost invisible. Yet the corporate structure Frederick Gilbert Bourne had shaped began to reorganize around new priorities. Administrative functions shifted. Departments relocated. The tower, conceived as a unified imperial emblem, gradually became a building increasingly shared with unrelated tenants. This was not scandal. It was arithmetic. Office buildings must justify their expense, and symbolism does not suspend operating costs. The Great Depression settled over Lower Manhattan in 1929 and lingered. Financial records from 1929 through 1935 show Singer struggling against shrinking consumer demand, currency instability abroad, and a global economy reoriented around survival. Occupancy rates in the tower declined further. The marble lobby and gilded elevator cages still welcomed visitors, but fewer arrived on Singer business. The monument was becoming a real estate holding that happened to bear a famous name. The Singer Tower's long decline reveals not corporate failure, but the fragility of architecture built for a single historical moment. Bourne understood the Gilded Age precisely. The tower was perfect for 1908, its height, its ornament, its Buick's, art's insistence that beauty conferred authority, its gilded crown proclaiming the ability to light the sky itself. The 20th century unfolded differently. 2 world wars, a global depression, shifting commercial centers, and a growing preference for efficiency over distinction reshaped Manhattan. Commerce moved northward. The narrow streets of Lower Broadway yielded primacy to Midtown's wider avenues. Glass and steel supplanted terracotta and gilded iron. The tower had been designed to endure a century. The century had other plans. Its demolition was not the product of a single dramatic decision. It accumulated through incremental choices that appeared reasonable in isolation. By the mid-1960s, the site at 149 Broadway attracted the attention of United States Steel, which planned what would become One Liberty Plaza. The new building required a footprint incompatible with the Singer Tower and promised returns the old structure could no longer generate. The tower was not destroyed out of hostility. It was destroyed because the land beneath it had grown more valuable than the architecture above. The demolition permit filed in 1967 recorded only essentials: address, structure type, method, contractor. There was no acknowledgement that the building was the tallest ever deliberately demolished, that its lantern crown had defined an era of the skyline, that Ernest Flagg had conceived it as a meditation on proportion and restraint. Permits register logistics, not loss. Preservationists protested. Organizations and individuals argued that the tower was architecturally and historically irreplaceable. They proposed adaptive reuse or integration into the new development. Their appeals were heard and declined. Not a single ornamental element was secured for public preservation. Marble became rubble. Terracotta became debris. The gilded iron crown was dismantled and removed without ceremony. One detail lingers from coverage of the demolition announcement. Museums were contacted about salvaging exterior ornament, the ironwork, the terracotta panels, the cornices. None made a formal offer. The cost of removal, transport, and storage was too great. The elements were large and fragile, difficult to exhibit. Constrained budgets prevailed. Nothing was saved. The demolition began in 1968. It was not a spectacular implosion, but a methodical dismantling from the top downward. Over weeks and months, cranes and heavy equipment reduced the structure floor by floor. Photographs in the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University document its gradual subtraction, crown removed, upper stories erased, shaft shortened, base diminished. The lantern crown disappeared first. Symbolically, the building was decapitated before the body fell. Workers took it apart in sections. Once separated, the gilded pieces no longer resembled the unified form they once composed. No museum truck waited below. No conservator oversaw the work. The fragments vanished without documented trace. The fact remains stark. The Singer Tower is the tallest building ever deliberately demolished. When it came down in 1968, no structure of comparable height had been intentionally destroyed. The record endures. It may remain unbroken, not because taller buildings will never fall, but because the deliberate erasure of such scale, without catastrophe, represents a threshold few cities are willing to cross again. What survives is the image, a luminous crown suspended above a dark city, a monument to ambition whose afterlife resides entirely in photographs. The building rose 6 to 12 feet into the air. It held the title of tallest building in the world for 18 months. It has held the record as the tallest building ever deliberately demolished ever since. One Liberty Plaza, which replaced the Singer Tower at 149 Broadway, was completed in 1972. Designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in the International style, it is a dark, rectilinear slab of steel and glass, 54 stories tall, occupying an entire city block. It projects the blunt geometric confidence of a structure, uninterested in ornament and unconcerned with beauty as a category of meaning. Within a few years of its completion, architectural critics described it as oppressive in scale and hostile to pedestrians at street level. It embodied precisely the corporate tower typology Ernest Flagg had argued against throughout his career. Flagg believed that if his model, a slender shaft, a clearly articulated crown, limited lot coverage, had shaped Manhattan's growth, the skyline might have evolved into something more graceful and humane. Instead, his masterwork was replaced by the very form it had been designed to resist. The city demolished the argument and constructed the counterargument in steel and glass. The photographic record at the Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library concludes with an image of the cleared site. For a brief moment, surrounding buildings are exposed in the gap where the Singer Tower had stood for 60 years. The streetscape appears disoriented, its proportions unsettled by the sudden absence of a familiar vertical anchor. The void did not last. One Liberty Plaza soon filled it, and within a decade the Singer Tower ceased to exist even as absence. Cities do not preserve gaps, they fill them and move forward. Today, the only evidence that the Singer Tower stood at 149 Broadway lies in archives, drawings at Columbia University's Avery Library, photographs at the Museum of the City of New York, demolition sequences, postcards, technical specifications. Everything on the site itself belongs to One Liberty Plaza, which carries no memory of what it replaced and was never intended to. What survives of the Singer Tower is not stone or steel, but light fixed in silver gelatin prints and early orthochromatic negatives. Photographers recognized, perhaps before Singer's executives did, that the building was becoming an image more durable than its physical form. The Avery Library preserves Ernest Flagg's original elevation drawings, rendered with an exacting precision that feels closer to meditation than documentation. Every cornice line, every mansard curve, every bracket supporting the gilded lantern crown appears with a clarity the completed building could only approximate. The Museum of the City of New York holds negatives spanning 5 decades. Harbor views at dawn. Midnight exposures capturing the illuminated crown against a sky that no longer exists above that longitude. A single structural fragment reportedly survived into the 1970s, before disappearing from record. No major museum mounted a salvage effort before demolition. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, established in 1965, was only 3 years old when permits were filed, too young, underfunded, and preoccupied with other losses to intervene. The institutional reflexes required for preservation had not yet formed. The building passed from mass to image without ceremony. Image is all that remains. There is a philosophical clarity in this transformation. A building that no longer stands cannot deteriorate. It cannot be poorly renovated or awkwardly surrounded. Preserved in photographs and drawings, the Singer Tower exists in permanent idealization, always 1908, always newly crowned, always briefly the tallest habitable structure on Earth. Stone decays. Steel corrodes, brick spalls. The photograph of the lantern crown against the harbor sky does not. It requires no maintenance and costs nothing to sustain. In losing the building, architecture gained what photographs alone can provide: freedom from entropy. Architectural schools continue to study the Singer Tower with an intensity disproportionate to its short reign. Flagg's tripartite theory, base, shaft, crown, remains a formal proposition that lost its historical moment, but not its intellectual force. Students encounter the tower as evidence that skyscrapers were once conceived as classical arguments. That restraint could be understood as structural courage. That ambition did not require bulk. The drawings in the Avery Library function as a quiet counterpoint to the present city. What stands in Manhattan today argues one position. The Singer drawings argue another. The debate remains unresolved. The drawings endure with patience. There is a familiar American pattern, in which the new surpasses the old, and is then criticized in turn. The Woolworth Building outlasted Singer. One Liberty Plaza, which erased Singer from the skyline, was itself criticized within a decade as graceless and indifferent to the street. The tower, demolished for economic obsolescence, was replaced by one judged aesthetically deficient. Financial logic prevailed. Aesthetic argument did not. The gilded lantern crown, assembled on site by ironworkers who climbed 12 feet to set panels against open sky, was dismantled, catalogued nowhere, claimed by no institution, and lost as completely as if it had never existed. Singer manufacturing continued for decades after the tower's destruction, eventually filing for bankruptcy in 2004. The sewing machines produced in the millions survive in attics, estate sales, collectors' workshops, and museum displays across dozens of countries. Many still function. Their cast, iron treadle bases, have outlasted the corporation that made them and the tower that celebrated them. The domestic machine proved more durable than the civic monument. The humble tool outlived the imperial gesture. The lesson about ambition is both simple and inexhaustible. Monuments are built to proclaim permanence. Often the proclamation is the only lasting element. The intention survives in the historical record. Long after the structure, intended to embody it, disappears. Frederick Gilbert Bourne believed the tower would secure his legacy. Ernest Flagg believed his design proposed a better city. Singer's executives believed the lantern crown would shine over the harbor for centuries. They misjudged the vehicle but understood the impulse. The impulse to rise upward, to mark the sky, to declare presence and meaning. Does not fade, it changes form. Singer built a needle pointing skyward. Like all needles, it was made to pass through rather than remain. It passed through time briefly and brilliantly. Buildings are not mourned as objects alone. What is mourned is the certainty that once made them seem permanent. At 149 Broadway, One Liberty Plaza stands in matte steel and reflective glass, absorbing light rather than shaping it. No plaque marks the site as the former home of the tallest inhabited building on Earth. No sign indicates that iron workers once climbed 6 to 12 feet to secure gilded panels against open sky, or that Bourne looked upward and saw permanence reflected back at him. Pedestrians move through the financial district without looking up. The harbor remains visible from nearby rooftops on clear days, uninterrupted by any lantern crown. The Singer Tower's remains are paper and silver, ink elevations in flat files, photographic negatives in acid-free sleeves, a dedication notice published on May 1, 1908, describing it as a monument to American industrial genius. These are its bones now, stored in climate-controlled rooms and examined by researchers who study what rose and fell within a single lifetime. Somewhere, in an attic or workshop, a Singer sewing machine still threads a needle with the same precision it demonstrated in 1908. Its cast iron frame is heavy and indifferent to history. It does not know it outlasted the tower built in its honor. It does not know the gilded crown that once announced its empire has vanished without a fragment preserved. It simply holds thread. When set in motion, it moves forward, then back, then forward again, stitching a seam that binds fabric against ordinary force.